They tied Nora Ashby to a cottonwood stake in the middle of the creek bed and left her there to drown in the spring mud, calling her cursed, calling her poison, calling her every name but her own. By the time Caleb Stride found her 3 days later, half dead and covered in leeches, the town of Bitter Ridge had already decided she was gone for good. But what they didn't know was this. The man who pulled her from that mud wasn't the forgiving kind, and the woman they tried to bury wasn't done living yet. This is the story of how the cursed became the reckoning. The smoke from the dying campfire stung Nora's eyes, but she kept them open anyway, staring up at the canvas roof of the covered wagon as it swayed with each rut in the trail. The smell of her stepfather's tobacco, mixed with the sour stench of unwashed bodies and rotting provisions, made her stomach turn. But she'd learned years ago that showing weakness only made things worse. She lay perfectly still on the wooden floor, her body wedged between crates of cornmeal and bundles of moth-eaten blankets, listening to the voices outside that decided her fate without ever asking her opinion. Her stepfather's voice cut through the morning air like a dull saw through green wood. "She's brought us nothing but trouble since her mama died. Crops failed the year she turned 12. Hens stopped laying the year after. Then came the fire that took the barn, and every damn thing in it." He spat, and Nora heard it hit the ground with a wet smack. "Preacher says some folks are marked by the devil, and I'm inclined to believe him. That girl's got a shadow on her that don't sit right." Nora's fingers curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave crescents in the skin. She'd heard this speech before, variations of it, whispered behind her back or shouted to her face, depending on how much whiskey her stepfather had consumed. Her mother had been the only thing standing between her and the full weight of his hatred. But consumption had taken her 2 winters ago, leaving Nora alone with a man who saw her as nothing more than a burden and a curse. Outside, her stepsister Violet's voice joined in, high-pitched and sharp as broken glass. "Papa's right. Ever since she came back from the river that day, she's been different. Won't hardly talk, just stares at people like she can see right through them. It ain't natural. The other girls in town won't even stand near her no more." There was a pause, then a cruel laugh. "Besides, she's 19 and still unmarried. What man's gonna want damaged goods that everyone says is cursed?" Her stepbrother Clayton grunted his agreement. "We're heading to new territory anyway. Fresh start and all. Don't make sense dragging dead weight along. The wagon's already overloaded, and we got 300 miles still to go. Food's running low as it is." Nora closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, like her mother had taught her during the bad times. Don't let them see you break. Don't give them the satisfaction. She'd survived 18 months of this treatment, 18 months of being blamed for every misfortune that befell the family, from spoiled milk to broken axles. She'd survived the whispers in Bitter Ridge, the way people crossed the street when they saw her coming, the way children pointed and mothers pulled them close. She'd survived all of it by staying silent, by working harder than anyone else, by making herself as invisible as possible. But this morning was different. This morning had a weight to it that pressed down on her chest like a stone, making it hard to draw breath. She'd felt it the moment she woke before dawn, that sick certainty that something terrible was coming. The same feeling she'd had the day before her mother died, the same feeling she'd had the day the barn burned, the wagon lurched to a stop. Nora's body slid forward, her shoulder slamming into a crate. She bit down on her tongue to keep from crying out, tasting copper. Heavy boots hit the ground outside, multiple pairs moving with purpose. The canvas flap at the back of the wagon flew open, and harsh sunlight flooded in, blinding her. Her stepfather's face appeared, backlit and shadowed. His features twisted into something between disgust and grim satisfaction. "Get up, girl. Time to settle accounts." Nora didn't move. Every instinct screamed at her to stay put, to make them drag her out, to fight. But she'd learned that fighting only made things worse. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself up on shaking arms and crawled toward the opening. Her dress, already threadbare and stained, caught on a nail and tore further. She didn't bother trying to fix it. When she emerged into the daylight, she found herself staring at a landscape that looked like God had given up halfway through making it. They'd stopped in a narrow valley between two rocky hills, where a seasonal creek had carved a deep channel through red clay and black mud. The water was low this time of year, leaving behind a treacherous expanse of sucking, clinging earth that stank of decay and stagnant water. Cottonwood trees grew along the banks, their roots exposed like bones, their branches reaching up toward a sky that was the color of old bruises. 3 figures stood waiting. Her stepfather Jeremiah, still holding his pipe, smoke curling up from the bowl like a question mark. Violet, her arms crossed over her chest, her pretty face arranged in an expression of righteous vindication. And Clayton, holding a coil of rope in his massive hands, his face blank as a butcher's about to slaughter a hog. "What's this about?" Nora's voice came out rougher than she intended, scratchy from disuse. She hadn't spoken more than a dozen words in the past week. Jeremiah took the pipe from his mouth and pointed it at her like a weapon. "This is about protecting what's ours. We can't afford to keep feeding a curse, and we sure as hell can't afford to bring one into new territory where we're trying to make a fresh start. You understand that, don't you, girl?" Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. "Oh, you're leaving me here. Leaving implies you might find your way back." Violet's smile was cruel and satisfied. "We're making sure that don't happen." The truth hit Nora like a fist to the gut. They weren't just abandoning her. They were going to kill her, or at least create circumstances where nature would do the job for them, leaving their hands technically clean. She took a step backward, but Clayton moved faster, his hand clamping down on her upper arm with crushing force. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You fight, and I'll make it hurt worse." Nora tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. He dragged her toward the creek bed, her feet slipping in the loose soil at the edge. She could see it now, what they intended, a cottonwood stake driven deep into the mud at the center of the creek bed, positioned perfectly where the spring floods would have been at their deepest just weeks ago. The mud around it was thick and black, the kind that would suck you down and hold you fast. "Please!" The word escaped before she could stop it, and she hated herself for the weakness. "Please don't do this. I'll leave. I'll go on my own. You'll never see me again." Jeremiah shook his head slowly, almost sadly. "Can't risk it. Can't risk you showing up somewhere, telling tales, ruining our reputation. Besides, the preacher said sometimes the only way to break a curse is to give it back to the earth. Says the mud will draw out the poison, cleanse the land. Seems fitting." They forced her down into the creek bed, and the moment her feet touched the mud, it began to pull at her, hungry and patient. Clayton wrapped the rope around her wrists first, pulling it tight enough to cut into her skin, then looped it around the stake. He worked efficiently, methodically, tying knots that wouldn't slip, wouldn't loosen, no matter how hard she struggled. Nora tried to kick at him, but her feet couldn't find purchase in the sucking mud. She screamed then, a raw sound that tore from her throat and echoed off the rocky hills. No one came. There was no one to come. They were miles from anywhere, on a trail used only by those desperate or foolish enough to take the shortcut through the Badlands. When Clayton finished, he stepped back, breathing hard, mud coating his boots up to the knee. Violet stood at the edge of the creek bed, her hand over her mouth, but her eyes were bright with something that looked uncomfortably like excitement. Jeremiah just stared down at Nora with those flat, dead eyes, puffing on his pipe. "The spring rains are due any day now," he said conversationally, like they were discussing the weather over dinner. "When they come, this creek bed will fill up fast. Flash floods, they call them. You'll have maybe an hour from the first drops till the water's over your head. Maybe less." He paused, seeming to consider. "Course, the mud might take you before that. I've heard tell of men sinking so deep in mud like this that they just disappear, swallowed up whole. Either way, it'll be over quick enough." "You're monsters," Nora whispered, her voice breaking. "All of you. Monsters." Violet laughed, the sound bright and terrible. "Says the cursed girl," says the devil's daughter. "At least we'll sleep easy, knowing you can't bring your poison to decent folk no more." They climbed back up the bank then, leaving her there, bound and sinking. Nora watched them walk back to the wagon, watched Clayton help Violet up, watched Jeremiah take one last look back before climbing onto the driver's seat. She watched the wagon roll away, the wheels creaking, the canvas cover flapping in the wind until it disappeared around the bend and she was alone. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. No birds sang in the cottonwoods, no insects buzzed in the grass. Just the faint whisper of wind through the branches and the obscene sucking sound of the mud as it continued its patient work. Pulling her down inch by inch, Nora tested the ropes. But Clayton had done his work well. The knots held fast, and every movement only made her sink deeper. The mud was up to her knees now, cold and thick, clinging to her dress, weighing her down. She could feel it pressing against her legs, feel the suction every time she tried to move. Panic rose in her throat, hot and choking, but she forced it down. Panic wouldn't save her. Panic would only make her sink faster. She looked up at the sky instead, at the clouds that were gathering on the western horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. Jeremiah had been right about that, at least. The spring storms were coming. She could smell it in the air, that electric scent that came before lightning, that particular quality of light that meant the heavens were about to open up. How long would it take? Hours? Days? How long could a person survive like this, bound and sinking, with no food, no water, except what fell from the sky, no hope of rescue? She thought about screaming again, but who would hear? The trail they'd taken was used maybe once a month, if that. The nearest town was 30 miles back, and even if someone came, even if by some miracle a traveler passed this way, would they help? Or would they see a woman tied to a stake in the mud and assume she deserved it, assume she was being punished for some crime? The first drop of rain hit her face, cold as a coin. Then another, then a dozen more, and suddenly the sky was opening up, releasing sheets of water that hammered down on her with surprising violence. Nora tilted her head back and opened her mouth, drinking what she could, knowing it might be the last clean water she tasted. The rain was cold, so cold it made her teeth chatter, but at least it washed some of the mud from her skin. At least it gave her something to focus on, besides the slowly tightening noose of earth around her legs. The creek bed began to change almost immediately. Water started flowing from upstream, a thin trickle at first, then more, moving faster, carrying debris, twigs, leaves, things she couldn't identify in the growing darkness. The mud around her loosened slightly with the water, but that was almost worse because it meant she could feel herself sinking more, feel the pull of the earth more strongly. Night fell, and with it came a cold that cut through her wet dress like knives. Nora's body began to shake uncontrollably, violent tremors that made her teeth rattle and her bones ache. She tried to keep moving, tried to flex her fingers and toes, but the cold was stealing her strength, making her clumsy, making her slow. The water was ankle-deep now, flowing around the stake, around her legs and rising. Somewhere in the darkness something splashed. Nora's head snapped up, her heart racing. What lived in water like this? Snakes, certainly. Maybe worse. She'd heard stories about the things that crawled out of muddy creek beds at night. Stories meant to frighten children, but now, alone in the dark with water rising around her, those stories felt terrifyingly real. The night stretched on forever. Hours blurred together in a haze of cold and fear and pain. The ropes had rubbed her wrists raw, and she could feel blood trickling down her hands, sticky and warm in contrast to the cold water. The mud had reached her thighs now, and the water was at her waist, still rising, still patient, still inevitable. Dawn came eventually, pale and grey, revealing a landscape transformed by the storm. The creek that had been nearly dry was now a rushing torrent, brown water churning with foam and debris. The stake she was tied to shuddered with the force of the current, and Nora realized with a sick certainty that when it gave way, and it would give way, she would be dragged under and drowned in seconds. She was so cold she could barely feel her body anymore. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as death, her hair plastered to her face in muddy tangles. She'd stopped shivering hours ago, which she knew was a bad sign, knew it meant her body was giving up, shutting down, preparing for the end. She thought about her mother, wondered if there was anything after this, if her mother was waiting somewhere beyond the dark. She thought about Jeremiah and Violet and Clayton, wondered if they felt any guilt at all, or if they'd already forgotten about her, already moved on to their new life in their new territory. The sun climbed higher, burning off some of the morning fog. The water began to recede slightly as the storm moved east, but Nora was too far gone to feel relief. She hung limply against the ropes, her head lolling forward, barely conscious. Thirst burned her throat despite the water all around her. Hunger gnawed at her belly. But more than anything, it was the exhaustion that threatened to drag her under. The bone-deep weariness that made her want to close her eyes and stop fighting. Just stop. That's when she heard it, hoofbeats, faint at first. Barely audible over the sound of rushing water, but growing louder, coming closer. Her head lifted, hope flaring painfully in her chest. Someone was coming. Someone was actually coming. She tried to call out, but her voice was gone, reduced to a hoarse whisper that wouldn't carry 5 feet. She tried again, forcing air through her damaged throat, and managed a sound that was more croak than word. The hoofbeats stopped. Silence. Had they heard her? Or had they passed by, continued on their way, never knowing she was here? Then a figure appeared at the top of the bank, silhouetted against the morning sky. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He stood perfectly still for a moment, looking down at her, and Nora couldn't read his expression, couldn't tell if he was horrified or indifferent or something else entirely. He moved then, sliding down the bank with surprising grace, his boots finding purchase where there seemed to be none. He hit the water at a run, splashing through the current toward her, and as he got closer, Nora could see his face. Odd features, weathered by sun and wind, a scar running through one eyebrow, eyes the color of smoke. He looked like he'd seen things, done things, survived things that would have broken weaker men. He didn't speak, just pulled a knife from his belt and started cutting the ropes, his movements quick and efficient. The moment the last rope parted, Nora collapsed forward, and he caught her, his arms surprisingly gentle despite their obvious strength. He lifted her out of the mud like she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest as he carried her back to the bank. Nora wanted to thank him, wanted to ask his name, wanted to explain what had happened, but her body had other ideas. The moment he set her down on solid ground, everything went dark. Consciousness slipping away like water through her fingers. The last thing she remembered was the stranger's voice, low and rough, speaking words she couldn't quite hear, and the feeling of being lifted again, this time onto a horse, and the warmth of a blanket being wrapped around her shaking body. Then nothing, just the dark and the distant sound of hoofbeats, and the hope, fragile as spider silk, that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end after all. Nora woke to the smell of pine smoke and coffee, and for one confused moment, she thought she was back in her mother's kitchen, back before the consumption, back when mornings meant warmth and safety instead of fear. Then the pain hit her, a wave of it that crashed through her body, from her raw wrists to her mud-caked legs, and reality came flooding back with brutal clarity. She wasn't home. She would never be home again. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light. She was lying on something soft, a real bed with an actual mattress, covered in heavy wool blankets that smelled faintly of cedar and leather. The ceiling above her was made of rough-hewn logs, the gaps chinked with clay and moss. A single window let in pale morning light, and she could see pine branches swaying beyond the glass. Wherever she was, it wasn't the creek bed. It wasn't death. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Her head swam, her vision blurring at the edges, and her muscles screamed in protest. How long had she been tied to that stake? 2 days? 3? Time had become meaningless in the cold and the dark, measured only by the rising water and the slow certainty of her approaching end. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice came from across the room, low and rough, with an accent she couldn't quite place. Mountain folk, maybe, or someone who'd spent too many years alone and forgotten how to shape words properly. "You've been out for near about 18 hours. Your body needs time." Nora turned her head carefully, slowly, and found the man from the creek bed sitting in a chair by the stone fireplace, a tin cup in his hands. In the daylight she could see him more clearly. He was probably in his early 30s, though the lines around his eyes suggested a hard life that might have aged him beyond his years. His hair was dark, worn longer than was fashionable, touching his collar. The scar through his eyebrow was old, white against tanned skin. He wore simple clothes, buckskin pants and a worn linen shirt, both clean but patched in places. A rifle leaned against the wall within easy reach. "Where am I?" Nora's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, her throat still raw from screaming and cold. "My cabin, about 15 miles northwest of where I found you." He took a sip of his coffee, his grey eyes never leaving her face. "You're lucky I came through when I did. Another few hours, and that stake would have given way. Creek was running mean after that storm." Nora closed her eyes, remembering the water rising, the cold seeping into her bones, the certainty that she was going to die alone and afraid in the mud. "Thank you," she managed, "for saving me." The man shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying both dismissal and acknowledgement. "Couldn't very well leave you there. Though I'll admit I considered it for a moment. Wanted to make sure you weren't dangerous before I cut you loose." Dangerous. Despite everything, Nora almost laughed. "I was tied to a stake in a creek bed. People don't end up in situations like that by accident." His voice was matter-of-fact, not accusing, just stating what he saw as obvious truth. "Generally means they did something to deserve it, or someone thought they did. I needed to know which before I brought you back here." The implication hung in the air between them. He'd watched her, evaluated her, made a judgment call about whether she was worth saving. The thought should have frightened her, but instead Nora felt a strange sort of respect. This man didn't make decisions lightly. He thought things through, weighed consequences. In a world where her stepfather had decided her fate based on superstition and spite, that kind of careful consideration felt almost like kindness. "They said I was cursed." The words came out flat, emotionless, because if she let any feeling into them, she'd break. "My stepfather and his children said I brought bad luck wherever I went. Crop failures, fires, sickness. They blamed me for all of it. When they decided to head west for a fresh start, they decided I couldn't come along. Said my curse would follow them, so they left me in that creek bed to die." The man was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those smoke-colored eyes. "Do you believe it?" he asked finally. "That you're cursed?" Nora had to think about that. Did she believe it? For so long she'd heard it over and over, until the words had worn grooves in her mind. Cursed, marked, poisoned, but believing something because other people told you to, and believing it because it was true, were two different things entirely. "No," she said slowly, testing the word on her tongue. "No, I don't. Bad things happen. Crops fail because of drought or blight. Fires start because someone's careless with a lamp. People get sick because sickness exists. None of that has anything to do with me. But it was easier for them to blame me than to accept that sometimes life is just hard and unfair." Something shifted in the man's expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around the edges. "Smart answer. Most folks would rather believe in curses than face the reality that the world doesn't care about their comfort." He set his cup down and stood, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of someone comfortable in his own body. "Name's Caleb Stride. I hunt for a living, trap some, guide occasionally when I need the coin. This cabin's been mine for about 8 years now. Nora Ashby." She hesitated, then added, "Or it was, anyway. I don't know what I am now." Caleb walked over to a rough wooden table and picked up a bundle wrapped in clean cloth. "You're a woman who survived something that should have killed her. That's what you are." He brought the bundle over and set it on the bed beside her. "Got your dress cleaned and mended as best I could. Burned your shoes, though. They were past saving. I've got some moccasins that might fit if you tie them tight." Nora stared at the bundle, something hot and tight building in her chest. When was the last time someone had done something kind for her without expecting anything in return? When was the last time someone had seen her as a person worth helping instead of a problem to be solved? She couldn't remember. "There's stew keeping warm by the fire," Caleb continued, moving back to his chair. "And bread from yesterday. It's a bit hard, but it'll fill your belly. When you're feeling up to it, we need to talk about what happens next. What happens next?" The word settled over Nora like a weight. She'd been so focused on surviving the immediate crisis that she hadn't thought beyond it. But Caleb was right. She couldn't stay here indefinitely, couldn't impose on a stranger's hospitality forever. And she had nowhere else to go. No family who wanted her, no friends who'd take her in, no money or skills or prospects. She was completely and utterly alone. "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted, the words bitter as ash in her mouth. "No money. No prospects. I can work, though. I'm strong, and I'm not afraid of hard labor. If you'll let me stay for a while, I'll earn my keep. I can cook, clean, mend. Whatever you need." Caleb was quiet again, that same considering look on his face. "This isn't charity," he said finally. "I live alone because I prefer it that way. Don't have much use for company or conversation. But winter's coming on, and having an extra pair of hands around wouldn't hurt. You can stay through the cold months, help with the work. Come spring, we'll figure out something more permanent." Relief flooded through Nora so suddenly it made her dizzy. "Thank you. I promise I won't be a burden. You won't even know I'm here." "Oh, I'll know you're here." For the first time, something that might have been humor flickered across Caleb's face. "Cabin's not that big, but as long as you pull your weight and don't cause trouble, we'll get along fine." Over the next few days, Nora learned the rhythms of Caleb's life, and they were nothing like what she'd known before. He woke before dawn and checked his trap lines, returning mid-morning with whatever he'd caught: rabbits, sometimes a fox, once a young deer that he butchered with practiced efficiency. He spoke little, moved with quiet purpose, and seemed perfectly content with long stretches of silence. It was strange at first, unsettling even, but Nora found herself adapting to it, finding a kind of peace in the absence of constant noise and conflict. She threw herself into work with an intensity that surprised even her. Every morning she woke when Caleb did, helping him prepare for the day's hunting. She learned to skin and tan hides, a messy and tedious process that left her hands cramped and aching, but produced soft leather that could be sold or traded. She learned to render fat for candles and soap, to smoke meat so it would keep through the winter, to identify which plants were edible and which were poison. Caleb taught her without really teaching, just doing his work and letting her watch, correcting her when she made mistakes, but never in a cruel way, never with the contempt she'd grown so accustomed to. The cabin itself was simple but well made. One large room with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. Caleb had given Nora the loft, taking for himself a pallet by the fireplace, and though she'd protested, he'd been immovable on the subject. "You need proper rest to heal," he'd said, and that was the end of it. The cabin had a good fireplace, a decent table, shelves lined with supplies, and hooks on the walls for hanging tools and game. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, built to last. And that said something about the man who'd made it. One afternoon, about a week after Nora's arrival, as she was grinding corn into meal, Caleb spoke up from where he was oiling his rifle. "You never asked me why I was on that trail. The one where I found you." Nora paused in her work. "Figured it wasn't my business." "It's not. But I'm telling you anyway." He didn't look up from his task, his hands moving with the same steady precision he brought to everything. "There's a bounty out on a man who killed a family over in Red Creek. Sheriff posted notices as far as Bitter Ridge. The man's hiding somewhere in the Badlands, and I was tracking him. Lost his trail in the storm, which is when I found you instead." A bounty hunter. Nora felt something cold slide down her spine. She'd heard stories about bounty hunters, about the kind of men who tracked other men for money, who lived by violence and died the same way. But Caleb didn't seem like the men from those stories. He was careful, methodical, almost gentle in his way. There was violence in him, certainly. She could see it in the controlled way he moved, in the weapons he kept close. But it was leashed violence. Purposeful. "Does that bother you?" Caleb asked, finally looking up. What I do? Nora considered the question carefully. Do you kill innocent people? No. Do you enjoy it? No. Then it doesn't bother me. She went back to grinding. You saved my life when you could have kept riding. That tells me more about who you are than what you do for money. She felt, rather than saw, Caleb's surprise, a shift in the air between them. Most people aren't that practical about it. Most people haven't been left to die in a creek bed by their own family. Nora's voice was sharper than she intended. I've learned not to judge people by what they claim to be. I judge them by what they do when no one's watching. That night, as they ate dinner in companionable silence, Nora found herself watching Caleb. When she thought he wasn't looking, he moved through the world like he was part of it, not separate from it. When he walked, he made no unnecessary sound. When he worked, he wasted no motion. Everything he did had a purpose, a reason. It was so different from the chaos and cruelty of her stepfather's household that it felt almost dreamlike. But it wasn't a dream. This was real. The cabin was real. The work was real. The strange, quiet man across from her was real. And for the first time since her mother died, Nora felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. Maybe she could make a life here. Maybe she could be useful, valuable, something other than a burden or a curse. Maybe the thought was interrupted by a sound outside, sudden and sharp. Caleb was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window with the same fluid grace that characterized all his movements. Nora froze, her hand halfway to her mouth with a piece of bread. Stay down, Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of command that made Nora obey without thinking. She slid from her chair and crouched below the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps? Hoofbeats? Nora couldn't tell. Caleb stood perfectly still, barely breathing, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the window. Then, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he relaxed slightly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dear, he said, lowering the rifle. Young buck by the sound of it, probably spooked by something. Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and climbed back into her chair. Her hands were shaking, she noticed. Caleb noticed too. You thought they came back for you. It wasn't a question. I don't know what I thought. Nora wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire's warmth. But yes, part of me keeps waiting for them to come back, to finish what they started. Even though I know that doesn't make sense. They think I'm dead. They have no reason to come looking. Caleb set his rifle back against the wall and returned to his seat. Fear doesn't have to make sense. It just is. He picked up his own piece of bread, examined it, then met her eyes. But for what it's worth, if they do come back, they'll have to go through me first. And I'm a lot harder to get past than a creek bed. The words were simple, matter-of-fact, but they hit Nora with surprising force. When was the last time someone had stood up for her, protected her? Her mother had tried, but she'd been sick and weak and ultimately powerless against Jeremiah's cruelty. But Caleb was neither sick nor weak, and something in his steady gaze told Nora he meant exactly what he said. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Let's just say I know what it's like to be thrown away by people who should have protected you, he said finally. And I decided a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to stop it happening to someone else, I would. There was a story there, Nora realized. A history that explained the scars and the solitude and the careful way he moved through the world. But she didn't ask, and Caleb didn't offer, and they finished their meal in silence that felt less empty than before. More like understanding. Later that night, lying in the loft and listening to the wind howl through the pines, Nora thought about curses and second chances. Her stepfather had tried to bury her, but she was still breathing. He'd called her poison, but Caleb had given her shelter. He'd said she would bring ruin, but here she was, learning to tan hides and grind corn, and maybe, just maybe, beginning to believe that she might be something other than cursed after all. The wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, but Nora wasn't afraid. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. And tomorrow, she would wake up and work and learn, and prove to herself and anyone watching that she was worth saving, that she was worth more than the mud they'd tried to bury her in. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, Nora dreamed not of drowning, but of walking through endless pine forests under endless sky, free and unbroken, and finally home. The days began to blur together in the best possible way. Nora rose with the sun and worked until exhaustion claimed her, her hands growing rougher but stronger, her mind finally, blessedly quiet. The constant fear that had defined her life in Bitter Ridge began to fade. She learned that Caleb was a man of patterns. He checked the northern trapline on Mondays and Thursdays, preferred his coffee strong, and cleaned his weapons every evening with ritual precision. He never left the cabin without scanning the tree line first. One evening, as Nora mended his shirt by firelight, she heard him humming as he carved spoons from pine. The knife moved with practiced ease. "You're good at that," she ventured. Caleb looked up, surprised. "Keeps my hands busy. Sold a set last winter." He examined the spoon critically. "Never know when you might need trade goods. Could you teach me?" Caleb studied her, then nodded slowly. "Wood carving requires patience. One wrong cut ruins hours of work." "I have patience," Nora said quietly. "I've had to learn it." Without another word, he pulled out a second knife and a block of pine, teaching her the basics for the next hour. The next morning brought the first real cold snap of autumn. Nora woke to frost on the window glass and her breath misting in the air. She climbed down from the loft to find Caleb already up, building up the fire. He glanced at her, taking in her thin dress, and frowned. "That won't do for winter," he said bluntly. "You'll freeze solid come December." He walked over to a trunk and pulled out a heavy wool blanket and buckskin leggings. "These were my mother's. She passed 5 years back, but she was about your size. You'll need proper winter clothes." Nora took the items carefully, reverently. "Your mother lived here?" "With you. Good for a time." Caleb's voice was neutral, but Nora heard the weight beneath it. "After my father died, she had nowhere else to go. I built the loft for her, gave her what comfort I could. But the winters here are hard. The cold took her one February—" "I'm sorry." Caleb shrugged, but Nora saw the tightness around his eyes. "She had 3 good years here. Said they were the most peaceful of her life." There was clearly more to that story, layers of pain Caleb wasn't ready to share. Instead, Nora held up the clothes and managed a small smile. "Thank you for trusting me with them. They're just clothes." But the way he said it, the gentleness in his voice, told Nora they were more than that. That afternoon, while Caleb was out checking traps, Nora took stock of the cabin's supplies. They had plenty of dried meat and smoked fish, but vegetables were scarce. She knew from experience that a winter diet without variety led to sickness. When Caleb returned near dusk, carrying 2 rabbits and a grouse, he found Nora sorting through withered root vegetables from the cold cellar. She looked up at his approach. "We need to find wild onions and pine nuts before the snow comes. And I saw cattails by the stream. The roots are edible if you prepare them right. We'll need more than just meat to stay healthy through winter." Caleb set down his catch and studied her. "You know foraging. My mother taught me before she got sick. Said a woman who could find food where others saw nothing would never starve." Nora stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Let me help gather what we need." For a moment Nora thought he might refuse, but then he nodded slowly. "Tomorrow morning we'll go together. I'll show you the good foraging spots, and you can teach me what you know." "Fair trade, fair trade," Nora agreed, and felt something settle into place between them. That night after dinner, Nora sat by the fire mending while Caleb cleaned his rifle. The silence between them was comfortable now, and Nora found herself thinking about how much had changed in just 2 weeks. She'd gone from drowning in mud to learning to carve wood, from being called cursed to being trusted with a dead woman's winter clothes. "Caleb," she said quietly, not looking up from her stitching. Why did you really save me? The truth. The question hung in the air. Caleb continued working on his rifle for a long moment. Then he set down his cleaning rod and met her eyes, because I've seen what happens when good people stand by and do nothing. I've seen men ignore screams in the night, seen families turn away from children who needed help. And I decided a long time ago that I wouldn't be that kind of man. That if I ever had the chance to stand between someone and the darkness, I would. He paused, his grey eyes intense in the firelight. You were tied to that stake and I had a choice. Let you die and keep riding, or do something about it. And I couldn't live with myself if I'd chosen wrong. Nora felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd shed since waking in this cabin. Not tears of sorrow, but of something that felt dangerously close to hope. Then I'm glad you're the kind of man you are, she whispered. Caleb nodded once, then went back to his work. And Nora went back to hers, but something had changed between them. Something important and fragile and worth protecting. They sat together in the firelight. Two people who'd been broken by the world and were slowly, carefully, learning how to be whole again. The first snow came 3 weeks after Nora arrived, falling silent and thick through the pines like a blanket being pulled over the world. She woke to an eerie quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes when snow muffles every sound, and for a moment she didn't know where she was. Then memory returned, along with the ache in her shoulders from yesterday's wood chopping, and she smiled into the darkness of the loft. She was safe. She was warm. She was alive. Caleb was already up, as always, stoking the fire to life. The orange glow painted shadows across the cabin walls, and Nora could smell coffee brewing, that bitter, strong scent that had become as familiar as breathing. She climbed down the ladder carefully, her feet finding the rungs by memory now, and found Caleb standing at the window, coffee cup in hand, staring out at the transformed landscape. It'll be a hard winter, he said without turning around. Snow came early. That's never a good sign. We'll need to check the traps more often, make sure they don't get buried. And we should bring in more firewood while we still can. Once the drifts get deep, it'll be near impossible to move around. Nora poured herself coffee and joined him at the window. The world outside had become unrecognizable. Every familiar landmark smoothed over and softened, the pines bending under the weight of snow on their branches. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, the kind of beauty that could kill you if you weren't careful. I've never seen snow like this, she admitted. In Bitter Ridge we got maybe a few inches each winter. Nothing like this. Caleb glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. You'll see worse before spring comes. Up here in the high country, snow can pile taller than a man. I've seen drifts that completely buried this cabin, leaving only the chimney sticking out. It's not the cold that gets you, though. It's the isolation, being trapped inside for days, sometimes weeks at a time, with nothing but your own thoughts for company. That's what breaks most people. There was weight in those words, a history of winters spent alone, and Nora wondered how Caleb had survived it without going mad. But then, maybe that was exactly what all his careful routines were for. The wood carving and weapon cleaning and trap checking. Ways to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. Ways to stay human when the world outside tried to strip that humanity away. They spent the morning hauling firewood from the covered woodpile behind the cabin, stacking it inside until they had enough to last a week. Nora's arms burned from the effort, her breath coming in white clouds that hung in the frigid air, but she didn't complain. Caleb worked beside her in companionable silence, and she'd learned that was his way of showing respect. He didn't coddle or treat her like she was fragile. He expected her to pull her weight, and somehow that felt more validating than any amount of empty praise. By mid-afternoon, they'd finished the wood and checked the nearby traps. Caleb had caught 2 rabbits and a fat marten, their pelts thick with winter growth. He showed Nora how to skin them properly, how to stretch the pelts on frames to dry, how to preserve the meat with salt. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but he was patient with her fumbling attempts, guiding her fingers when she struggled with a particularly difficult spot. "You're getting better at this," he said as she finished her first solo skinning job. The pelt wasn't perfect. A few nicks where her knife had slipped, but it was intact and usable. Another month and you'll be able to do it in your sleep. Pride warmed Nora's chest. I had a good teacher. Something that might have been a smile flickered across Caleb's face, gone almost before she could register it. You're a quick study. That's more important than having a good teacher. I've tried to show plenty of folks things over the years. Most of them were too stubborn or too stupid to learn. That evening, as they ate rabbit stew by the fire, Caleb suddenly spoke up. There's a trading post about a day's ride south of here. Place called Pine Hollow. I usually make a trip there before the deep snows hit. Trade furs for supplies we can't make, or hunt ourselves. Sugar, flour, maybe some tobacco if they have any worth buying. I was planning to go tomorrow. Nora looked up from her bowl, her heart sinking. She'd known this moment would come eventually, the moment when Caleb would have to leave and she'd be alone again. The cabin suddenly felt too large, too empty at the thought. How long will you be gone? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather turns. Caleb studied her face, and she wondered what he saw there. I was thinking you should come with me. Nora blinked, certain she'd misheard. What? You've been cooped up here for weeks now. Might do you good to see other people. Remember, there's a world beyond these 4 walls. Besides, I could use the extra hands for hauling supplies back. And it'll give you a chance to see what a real trading post looks like. Meet the folks who run it. The offer hung in the air between them. Part of Nora wanted to leap at it, craved the chance to see something new, talk to people who weren't Caleb, but another part, the part that still woke gasping from nightmares about being tied to that stake, recoiled at the thought of being seen, of being judged, of someone recognizing her. What if someone knows me? The words came out smaller than she intended. What if word has spread about what happened, about the cursed girl who was supposed to die in that creek bed? Caleb was quiet for a moment, then he set down his bowl and met her eyes. Pine Hollow is 3 territories away from Bitter Ridge. The folks there have never heard of you, and even if they had, you're not that person anymore. You're not the scared girl your stepfather tried to bury. You're someone who survived, who learned to tan hides and carve wood and work harder than most men twice your size. That's who they'll see if you let them. The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction, made something tight loosen in Nora's chest. He believed what he was saying. He saw her as strong, capable, worthy, and maybe, just maybe, she could start seeing herself that way too. All right, she said, her voice stronger now. I'll go. They left at first light the next morning, Caleb on his bay gelding, and Nora on a sturdy pack mule named Bessie, who had a temperament as calm as still water. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the world crystal clear and blindingly bright. Nora had never ridden much before, and her thighs ached within the first hour. But she gritted her teeth and focused on the rhythm, the gentle, swaying motion that eventually became almost meditative. Caleb led them through trails that Nora never would have seen on her own, paths that wound between massive pines and over frozen streams, always heading south and slightly east. He moved with absolute confidence, never hesitating at forks in the trail, reading the land like other people read books. Occasionally, he'd point out landmarks, a lightning-struck tree that marked the boundary of his usual hunting grounds, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear, a clearing where he'd once fought off a mountain lion. They stopped for lunch beside a frozen waterfall, the ice creating fantastic sculptures that caught the sunlight and threw rainbows across the snow. Caleb built a small fire and heated salt pork and hard biscuits, simple food but filling. As they ate, Nora found herself studying him, really looking at him for the first time in days. He'd become so familiar that she'd stopped seeing the details, the scar through his eyebrow, the calluses on his hands, the way his jaw tightened when he was thinking about something serious. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. Caleb looked up from his food. "You can ask." "Don't promise I'll answer. Why do you live alone? I mean, I understand wanting solitude, but you've built a good life up there. You could have a wife, a family. Why choose isolation?" The question seemed to surprise him. He was quiet for so long that Nora thought he wouldn't answer. that she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. But then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I told you about my mother, how she came to live with me after my father died. What I didn't tell you was why she had nowhere else to go." He poked at the fire with a stick, not meeting her eyes. "My father was a respected man in our town. Successful merchant, pillar of the church, all that. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. He beat my mother regularly, broke her arm once, her ribs another time. And when I got old enough to try to stop him, he started on me too." Nora's breath caught, but she didn't interrupt. "When I was 16, I fought back for real. Put him in the ground with my bare hands during one of his rages. Self-defense, clear as day, but the town didn't see it that way. They saw a son who killed his father, and they decided I was dangerous, cursed, marked by violence. Ran me out on a rail. My mother tried to defend me, but that just made them turn on her too. We left together, came out here to the wilderness where people's opinions don't matter much. Built this cabin, lived quiet. She died happy, or at least at peace, and that's more than she ever got in that town." He finally looked up, his grey eyes hard as flint. "So to answer your question, I live alone, because I learned that communities are only as good as their worst members. And most communities, when you scratch the surface, are rotten at the core. They'll call you cursed to justify their own cruelty, call you dangerous to excuse their own violence. I'd rather live with wolves than with people like that." Nora felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. She knew exactly what he meant, had lived it herself. "They called you cursed too," she whispered. "They did. Still probably do, if anyone remembers me. But out here, there's no one to care about curses or reputations. There's just survival, and whether you're strong enough to make it through another winter. That's honest in a way civilization never is." They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them. Two people who'd been cast out by the world they were born into and had somehow found each other in the wilderness. It felt significant, weighty, like a door opening onto something Nora couldn't quite name yet. They reached Pine Hollow just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible in their intensity. The trading post was bigger than Nora had expected, a sprawling complex of buildings clustered around a central courtyard. There was the main store, a barn for livestock, a smithy with its forge glowing red in the gathering dusk, and several smaller structures that might have been living quarters or storage. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and the smell of cooking food made Nora's stomach growl despite their earlier meal. A woman emerged from the main building as they dismounted, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that took in everything at once. But her smile was genuine as she approached, Caleb stride. "As I live and breathe. Thought maybe the mountain had finally swallowed you up. It's been, 8 months since you last came through?" Her eyes shifted to Nora, assessing but not unkind. "And you brought company." "That's a first. Martha." Caleb nodded respectfully. "This is Nora Ashby. She's staying with me through the winter, helping with the trap lines. Nora, this is Martha Coltrane. She and her husband run Pine Hollow." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly, but she extended a hand to Nora without hesitation. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused from years of hard work. "Pleased to meet you, Nora. Any friend of Caleb's is welcome here. You two must be frozen solid. Come inside, we've got hot food and warm beds." The inside of the trading post was overwhelming after weeks in Caleb's quiet cabin. It was warm and bright, with lanterns hanging from the ceiling and a massive fireplace taking up most of one wall. The walls were lined with shelves stocked with everything imaginable: tools, fabric, preserved foods, medicines, weapons. A few other people sat at a long table near the fire, eating and talking in low voices. They looked up as Nora and Caleb entered, their conversations dying briefly before resuming. Martha led them to the table and brought bowls of venison stew that was rich and thick, seasoned with herbs Nora couldn't identify. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, while Caleb talked quietly with Martha's husband. a bear of a man named Thomas, who had hands like hams and a booming laugh that filled the space. "So you're the one who finally got Caleb to bring someone down from that hermit's cave of his," Thomas said, grinning at Nora. "Must be something special about you. He's turned down at least a dozen offers to take on partners or apprentices over the years." Nora felt her face heat. "I don't know about special. I just needed somewhere to go, and Caleb was kind enough to offer shelter." "Kind," Martha snorted. "That's not a word most people would use to describe Caleb's stride. Competent, yes. Reliable, certainly. But kind, you must have made quite an impression." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to being the center of attention. "She works hard and doesn't complain. That's rare enough to be worth noting." The conversation moved on to business after that. Caleb and Thomas discussing fur prices and supply needs, while Martha showed Nora the fabric selection, talking about which materials held up best in harsh winters. Nora found herself relaxing despite her earlier anxiety, drawn into Martha's easy manner and practical wisdom. This woman had clearly carved out her own space in the wilderness, built something lasting, and she hadn't needed anyone's permission to do it. That night, Nora slept in a real bed in a room Martha kept for travelers, and she dreamed of possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine before. She saw herself not just surviving, but building something, not just hiding, but living. And when she woke in the morning to Martha's voice calling that breakfast was ready, she felt something shift inside her, like a seed beginning to crack open after a long dormancy. The second day at Pine Hollow, Caleb was busy negotiating trades and checking over supplies, so Nora spent most of the morning helping Martha in the store. She learned how to measure flour and sugar without scales, how to identify good leather from bad, how to spot when a customer was trying to cheat you. Martha was a font of practical knowledge, delivered with dry humor, and Nora found herself laughing more than she had in months. "You're good with people," Martha observed as they took a break for lunch. "Got a way of putting them at ease without being false about it. That's a valuable skill out here, where most folks are half wild from isolation." "I don't feel very good with people," Nora admitted. "Most of my life people have made it clear I wasn't wanted." Martha's eyes softened. "Well, that says more about them than it does about you, doesn't it? I can spot quality when I see it, and you've got it. Whatever happened before you ended up with Caleb, that's not who you are now. Out here, we care about what you can do and whether you can be trusted. Everything else is just noise." Those words settled into Nora's bones, warm and solid. She'd spent so long being defined by other people's judgments that she'd forgotten she could define herself. But maybe it wasn't too late to start. That afternoon, a family came through, heading west with everything they owned packed into a covered wagon. The wife was heavily pregnant, the husband looked exhausted, and their 3 children were thin and quiet in that way children get when they've known too much hunger. Martha and Thomas gave them supplies without asking for payment, and when the family tried to insist, Thomas just shook his head. "Pay it forward when you can," he said simply. "Help someone else when you're on your feet again. That's how we survive out here." Watching them leave, Nora felt something shift in her understanding of the world. Maybe civilization wasn't rotten at the core, as Caleb believed. Maybe it was just that some people had forgotten what really mattered, had let fear and superstition override their basic humanity. But here, in this isolated trading post in the middle of nowhere, she was seeing something different. People helping people, not because they had to, but because they could. On their last night before heading back to the cabin, Nora sat by the fire with Caleb, both of them quiet and tired from a long day. The trading post had settled into evening calm, most people already in bed, just the crackling fire and the distant sound of wind for company. "Thank you for bringing me here," Nora said softly. "I didn't realize how much I needed this. Seeing that there are good people in the world, people who choose kindness over cruelty." Caleb was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "Martha and Thomas are exceptions, not the rule. Don't let one decent trading post make you forget what people are capable of." "I won't forget," Nora promised. But I won't let it define me anymore either. What my stepfather did, what the town believed about me, that's their burden to carry, not mine. I'm done being the cursed girl. I'm just Nora now, and Nora is strong enough to survive anything." Caleb turned to look at her then, really look at her, and something in his expression made Nora's breath catch. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close, a softening around his eyes that spoke of respect and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something deeper. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I believe you are." They rode back to the cabin the next morning with saddlebags full of supplies and something intangible but equally valuable: hope. The winter would be long and hard, but Nora no longer feared it. She'd found her strength, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The deep winter came in January, with a fury that took even Caleb by surprise. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in its bucket within minutes of being brought inside, and the wind howled through the mountains like something alive and hunting. They burned through firewood faster than anticipated, and Caleb spent long hours outside in the bitter cold, chopping and hauling, while Nora kept the cabin warm and meals ready. It was brutal, exhausting work, but they fell into a rhythm that felt almost like partnership, each anticipating the other's needs without words. Nora had changed in the months since the trading post visit. Her hands were rough and capable now, her body lean and strong from constant work. She could skin a deer as cleanly as Caleb, tan hides until they were butter soft, and she'd become surprisingly good at whittling small figures from pine scraps during the long evenings. More than that, though, something had shifted in the way she carried herself. The hunched, fearful posture was gone, replaced by a straightness in her spine that spoke of someone who'd found their footing in the world. They were finishing breakfast one morning when they heard it. Hoofbeats approaching through the snow, multiple horses moving fast. Caleb was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, his face gone hard and alert. Nora's heart kicked into a gallop, her mind immediately jumping to her stepfather, to Jeremiah coming back to finish what he'd started. But Caleb shook his head slightly, reading her fear. "That's not your family," he said quietly, moving to the window. "Too many horses, and they're coming from the wrong direction. Stay back from the door." 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses blowing steam in the frigid air. Even from inside the cabin, Nora could see they were rough men, the kind who made their living on the edges of civilization, where laws were suggestions rather than rules. They wore heavy coats and wide-brimmed hats, and all 3 had rifles across their saddles. The one in front, a man with a scarred face and a beard that hadn't seen trimming in months, raised his hand in what might have been a greeting, or might have been a warning. Caleb opened the door but didn't step outside, keeping the threshold between himself and the strangers. "Help you gentlemen with something?" The scarred man dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. "Name's Pike. We're tracking a man who killed a sheriff's deputy down in Red Creek. Trail led us up this way, and we're wondering if you've seen anyone passing through." Tall fellow, dark hair, missing 2 fingers on his left hand. Nora watched from her position by the hearth, her hand resting on the knife Caleb had given her weeks ago. Something about these men felt wrong, predatory, like they were circling prey rather than seeking justice. Caleb must have felt it too, because his posture remained tense, coiled. "Haven't seen anyone like that," Caleb said evenly. "We're pretty isolated up here. Most folks don't come through during winter unless they're lost or desperate." Pike's eyes moved past Caleb, scanning the cabin's interior, and when they landed on Nora, something ugly flickered across his face. "That your woman?" "That's none of your concern." Caleb's voice dropped lower, taking on an edge that made the air feel dangerous. "Now I've answered your question. Time for you to move along." One of the other men, younger with a mean mouth, snickered. "Awful protective over someone who ain't your concern. Maybe we should come in, warm up a bit, see if your memory improves with some hospitality." "No." The single word was flat, final, and backed by the subtle shift of Caleb's rifle to a more ready position. "You can water your horses at the stream to the south, but you're not welcome inside. That's the only hospitality you're getting." Pike's face darkened, his hand moving toward his gun, and Nora's breath caught. But then Caleb did something that surprised her. He whistled, sharp and piercing, and from the tree line behind the cabin came an answering sound, the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked. The three men froze, their eyes darting to the trees, suddenly aware that they might not be the ones with the advantage. "I don't work alone," Caleb said quietly, though Nora knew with absolute certainty that there was no one in those trees, that the sound had been some trick, some bluff executed perfectly. "And I don't take kindly to threats on my property. So here's how this is going to work. You're going to mount up, ride south like I suggested, and forget you ever saw this cabin. Do that and we all walk away breathing. Push it, and I promise you won't make it back down the mountain." For a long moment nobody moved. The tension stretched thin as wire ready to snap. Then Pike spat in the snow and swung back onto his horse. "This ain't over, friend. We'll remember this." "I'm counting on it," Caleb replied, his voice cold as the winter air. They watched the three men ride away, disappearing into the pines. Caleb didn't move from the doorway until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely, and even then he stood there for another few minutes, scanning the tree line. Finally, he closed the door and set his rifle back against the wall, but his jaw was tight, his eyes troubled. "That wasn't about tracking a killer," Nora said quietly. "They were looking for something else." "No, it wasn't." Caleb moved to the window, watching the direction the men had gone. "Pike Garrison. I've heard of him. He runs with a gang out of the territories, mostly robbery and claim jumping. They prey on isolated homesteaders, people who can't fight back or call for help. The sheriff's deputy story was just an excuse to scout for targets." Fear coiled in Nora's stomach, but it was different from the helpless terror she'd felt tied to that stake. This was sharper, cleaner, mixed with anger. "They'll come back, probably. Men like that don't like being challenged. They'll wait a few days, maybe a week, let us think we're safe. Then they'll come back with more men, thinking to overwhelm us with numbers." Caleb finally turned to face her, and his expression was grim. "I need you to understand something, Nora. If they come back, it won't be pretty. I'll do what I have to do to protect us, but that means violence. Real violence, not just threats. Can you handle that?" Nora thought about the question, really thought about it. Could she handle watching Caleb kill men, even bad men? Could she participate in that violence if necessary? A few months ago the answer would have been an automatic no, born from a lifetime of being taught to be meek and obedient. But that woman had drowned in a creek bed. The woman standing here now had learned to skin animals and chop wood, and survive in a wilderness that killed the weak. She'd learned that sometimes the world demanded hardness, that kindness couldn't exist without the willingness to protect it. "Yes," she said simply, "I can handle it." Something shifted in Caleb's eyes, a mix of respect and something else, something warmer. "Good. Then we need to prepare. If they're coming back, I want to be ready." The next 3 days were a blur of activity unlike anything Nora had experienced. Caleb transformed from quiet hunter to tactical strategist, and Nora got a glimpse of the man he must have been before he retreated to this mountain. He showed her how to load and fire his spare rifle, making her practice until her shoulder ached from the recoil, but her hands moved with confidence. He taught her about sightlines and cover, where to position herself to have the best advantage. They moved supplies, creating fallback positions and caches of ammunition hidden around the cabin. "You ever killed a man?" Nora asked one evening as they sat cleaning weapons by firelight. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Yes, the first was my father, you know that. But there have been others. Bounty hunting isn't a gentle profession. Most men I track come quietly, see the futility in fighting. But some choose violence, and I've learned to be better at it than they are. It doesn't sit easy, even when it's justified. Taking a life, even a life that needs taking, it leaves a mark on you. Do you regret it?" "Mom, I regret that it was necessary." But I don't regret doing what had to be done to survive, to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves." He looked up at her, his grey eyes serious. "If it comes to it, if you have to pull that trigger, you aim for the center of the chest. Not the head, not the legs. Center mass, and you don't hesitate. Hesitation will get you killed." Nora nodded, committing his words to memory. She practiced in her mind, imagining the moment, preparing herself mentally for what might come. She refused to be helpless again, refused to be the victim. If Pike and his men came back expecting an easy target, they were going to find something very different. On the fourth day, just before dawn, Caleb woke her with a hand over her mouth. "They're here," he whispered. 5 of them moving through the trees from the east. "Get to your position." Nora's heart hammered, but her hands were steady as she grabbed the rifle and moved to the loft window where they'd prepared her station. From here, she had a clear view of the eastern approach, partially hidden behind a curtain, while still able to shoot if necessary. Caleb took his position by the main door, another rifle propped nearby for quick access. They'd talked through various scenarios, planned for different approaches. Now it was time to see if their preparations would be enough. The attack, when it came, was less organized than Nora had feared. Pike and his men clearly thought they were dealing with a lone hunter and a woman, easy prey. They rode up openly, spreading out in a loose arc around the cabin. Pike called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. "Stride! We're not here for trouble. Just want to talk, maybe work out an arrangement. These are hard times, and a man needs friends in hard times." Caleb didn't respond, didn't show himself. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of horses shifting in the snow and men breathing steam into the cold air. Nora could see the frustration building on Pike's face, the way his hand kept drifting toward his gun. "All right, have it your way." Pike shouted, "Boys, burn them out!" 2 of the men dismounted and started toward the cabin, torches in hand, and that's when Caleb fired. The shot cracked through the morning air, and one of the torches spun away as the man holding it grabbed his arm and fell. Caleb had aimed to wound, giving them one more chance to retreat. But Pike's response was immediate and violent. He drew his gun and fired at the cabin, the bullet punching through the wooden walls with a sound like thunder. "Nora, east window," the one in the red coat. Caleb's voice was calm, controlled, nothing like the chaos erupting outside. Nora sighted down the rifle, found the man Caleb meant. He was aiming at the cabin door, and she knew if she didn't act, he'd kill Caleb. The moral calculus was simple and terrible. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, and through the smoke she saw the man stagger and fall. She'd hit him in the chest, just like Caleb taught her. He didn't get up. Nora's hands shook, bile rising in her throat. But she forced it down and worked the bolt, chambering another round like Caleb had drilled into her. There was no time for horror, no time for regret. Only survival. The fight lasted maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. Caleb's marksmanship was devastating, each shot carefully placed, efficient. 2 more men went down, and suddenly Pike was alone, his horse dancing nervously as he realized how badly he'd miscalculated. He fired wildly, more in panic than with any real aim, then wheeled his horse and fled into the trees. Caleb let him go. "Let him spread the word," he said grimly. "Let everyone know what happens when you come after us." The aftermath was harder than the fight itself. Nora climbed down from the loft on shaking legs and stood in the doorway, looking at the bodies in the snow. 4 men dead because they'd chosen violence, because they'd seen 2 people as easy victims. She'd killed one of them, taken a life. The weight of it pressed down on her like a physical thing. Caleb appeared beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "First time's the hardest. You're going to feel sick maybe for days. You're going to see his face when you close your eyes. That's normal. That's what separates people like us from people like them. We feel it and they don't." "I don't regret it," Nora said, her voice hollow. "He would have killed you. I did what I had to do. But God, Caleb, I can still see him falling." "Good. Hold on to that feeling. It'll keep you human, keep you from becoming like them. You protected yourself and someone you care about. That's not murder. That's survival." They spent the rest of the day dealing with the grim necessities, dragging the bodies away from the cabin, seeing to the wounded man who'd been hit in the arm first. He was barely conscious, bleeding heavily, and Caleb made the decision to cauterize the wound and leave him with supplies at the tree line. If he's smart, he'll head to Pine Hollow and get real help. If he's not, nature will take care of him. Either way, he's not our problem anymore. That night, neither of them could sleep. They sat by the fire, not talking, just being present with each other. Nora kept seeing that moment when she pulled the trigger, kept wondering about the man she'd killed. Did he have family, people who loved him? Or was he as alone and desperate as she'd been? The questions circled in her mind like vultures. "I never wanted this for you," Caleb said finally. "When I pulled you out of that creek bed, I thought I was saving you from death. I didn't think about what kind of life I was saving you for. Maybe leaving you there would have been kinder." Nora looked at him sharply. "Don't you dare say that. Don't you dare suggest that dying in that mud would have been better than this. Yes, today was horrible. Yes, I'm going to carry what I did for the rest of my life. But I'm alive, Caleb. I'm alive and I'm strong, and I'm not a victim anymore. Those men came here intending violence, and they found people who wouldn't be easy prey. That's not something to regret. That's something to be proud of." Caleb stared at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled. Really smiled, not the ghost of humor, but genuine warmth. "You're right. You've become something remarkable, Nora Ashby. Your stepfather tried to bury you, but all he did was plant seeds, and look what grew." The words settled into Nora's chest, warm and solid. She'd survived attempted murder, isolation, brutal winter, and now a gunfight with outlaws. She'd killed to protect what mattered, and she'd do it again if she had to. The cursed girl from Bitter Ridge was gone, transformed into someone stronger. Someone who understood that sometimes survival meant being willing to fight, to bleed, to take stands that left marks on your soul. "Come spring," Caleb said quietly, "when the pass is clear and travel becomes easier, people are going to hear about what happened here, about the woman who fought beside me, who held her ground against outlaws. Some will call it unwomanly. Some will say you're dangerous, but others will see it for what it is, strength. And they'll respect you for it. Let them talk," Nora replied. "I've been called cursed, dangerous, unwomanly, all of it. Words don't scare me anymore. I know who I am now, and that's enough." They sat together as the fire burned low, two people who'd been cast out by civilization and had built something better in the wilderness. They defended it with blood, and would defend it again if necessary. And somewhere in the transformation from victim to survivor to warrior, Nora had found not just strength, but purpose. She was no longer running from her past. She was building a future, one difficult choice at a time. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying away the smoke from the day's violence. By morning, fresh snow would cover the blood-stained ground, nature erasing the evidence of human conflict with quiet efficiency. But Nora would remember. She'd carry this day forward, let it shape her into someone even stronger. The weeks following the attack brought an unexpected peace. Caleb set up warning bells in the forest approaches, and they took turns on watch during nights. But no one came. Pike had apparently taken the message to heart. "This is decent. What surprised Nora most was how the experience had changed things between her and Caleb. There was a new ease between them, born from having faced death together. He trusted her now with his safety, his life, and she trusted him with truths she'd never spoken aloud. One evening, as they worked together preparing hides, Nora found herself talking about her mother, really talking about her for the first time. "She was gentle," Nora said quietly. "Too gentle for the world she lived in. My real father died when I was 3. She remarried Jeremiah because she thought I needed a father. But Jeremiah saw her gentleness as weakness." Caleb listened without interrupting, his hands busy with work. "The night she died, she made me promise I wouldn't let them break me the way they broke her. She said I had iron in my spine that she never had. But after she was gone, I forgot. I let them make me believe I was cursed. You remembered it when it mattered most," Caleb said quietly. "That's what counts," Nora looked up at him. "You helped me remember everything you've taught me, the way you've treated me like an equal. It gave me back something I thought was lost forever." Caleb set down his scraper and met her eyes. "You did the hard part yourself. The strength was always yours, Nora. You just needed to believe in it." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. When had Caleb become more than her rescuer? When had his rare smiles started meaning more than they should? But Caleb, as if reading her thoughts, spoke again. "Nora, when spring comes, you're not obligated to stay here. You've more than earned your keep. If you want to go to Pine Hollow or further west, I'll give you supplies and coin enough to start fresh. You don't have to stay in the wilderness with a hermit." The words hit Nora like a physical blow. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" "What I want doesn't matter." Caleb's voice was carefully neutral. "This is about what's best for you. You could have a real home, a real family. Don't I get a say in what I deserve?" Nora's voice came out sharp, anger flaring. "You're making decisions about my future without asking me what I want." "Jeremiah did that. I thought you were different." Caleb's expression flickered. "I'm trying to do right by you. Then ask me what I want instead of telling me what I should want." Nora stood, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "If you want me to leave come spring, say so plainly. But don't dress it up as caring about my future. Have the courage to be honest." For a long moment Caleb just stared at her. Then slowly something raw and honest entered his eyes. "I don't want you to leave," he said quietly. "But I'm afraid of being selfish. You've brought life back to this place, Nora. You've brought life back to me. But that's not a good enough reason to ask you to stay in exile with me." Nora's anger drained away. "What if I don't see it as exile anymore? What if I see it as home?" The question hung between them. Caleb looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing all of her. "Then I'd like you to stay," he said simply, "for as long as you want. Not as someone working off a debt, but as a partner. Someone who shares this life with me because they choose to." "I choose to stay," Nora said, her voice steady and sure. "Because this cabin and these mountains and you have given me something I never had before, the freedom to decide my own fate. And I choose this. I choose you." Something shifted in the air between them. Caleb stood slowly and crossed the space between them. And when he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his hand was gentle despite its calluses. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "Because once you make this choice, people will talk. They'll say you're ruined, that you're living in sin. Are you prepared for that?" Nora thought of everything she'd survived, every judgment that had been passed on her, and she found she didn't care what anyone thought anymore. "Let them talk," she said. "I've been called worse than ruined. I've been called cursed, remember? And we both know how that turned out." Caleb smiled then, that rare, genuine smile, and Nora felt her heart expand with something she was almost afraid to name. This wasn't safe, gentle love. This was something forged in fire and blood, built on mutual respect and shared survival. That night they talked until the fire burned to embers, making plans for spring, for the future, for a life built on their own terms. And when Nora finally climbed to the loft, she did so knowing that she'd found something more valuable than safety or comfort. She'd found belonging. Spring arrived with a violence that matched winter's fury, the snow melting so fast it turned every stream into a raging torrent and every path into a river of mud. Nora stood on the cabin porch watching the world transform, feeling the warm sun on her face for the first time in months. She'd survived her first mountain winter, and the achievement felt monumental. Proof, written in her calloused hands and lean frame, that she was stronger than anyone back in Bitter Ridge had ever imagined. Caleb emerged from the cabin with 2 cups of coffee, handing her one as he joined her in surveying the landscape. They'd fallen into an easy domesticity over the past weeks, small touches and shared glances that spoke of the shift in their relationship. They hadn't put words to it yet, hadn't made any formal declarations. But Nora felt the change in every gesture, every moment of comfortable silence. "Trail to Pine Hollow should be passable in another week," Caleb said, sipping his coffee. We'll need to make a run soon, trade the winter pelts while they're still worth something. Martha and Thomas will want to hear we survived Pike's attempt. Nora nodded, but a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Going to Pine Hollow meant being seen, being known. And while she'd made peace with her choice to stay with Caleb, she knew the choice would invite judgment from others. People talked, and news traveled even in the wilderness. As if summoning her fears into being, they heard horses approaching from the south trail. Multiple horses moving at a steady pace rather than the aggressive charge that had preceded Pike's attack. Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but his posture was watchful rather than immediately defensive. 5 riders emerged from the tree line, and Nora's heart stopped. She knew those figures would have known them anywhere, despite the months that had passed. Jeremiah sat rigid in his saddle, looking older and grayer than she remembered. Violet rode beside him, her pretty face drawn and tired. Clayton brought up the rear, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. But it was the other 2 riders that made Nora's breath catch. A thin woman she didn't recognize, and a man wearing a tin star on his vest. "Stay behind me," Caleb said quietly. But Nora shook her head. "No, this is my past. I need to face it." The riders stopped at a respectful distance, and the man with the star raised his hand in greeting. "Morning. Name's Sheriff Hawkins out of Red Creek. I'm looking for a woman named Nora Ashby. I was told she might be here." Nora stepped forward, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. "I'm Nora Ashby." The sheriff studied her with sharp eyes, taking in her buckskin clothing, her sun-weathered face, the rifle within easy reach. Whatever he'd expected to find, it clearly wasn't this. "Miss Ashby, these folks here claim you're their daughter, that you ran away last fall and they've been searching for you. They want you to come back with them." "Stepdaughter," Nora corrected, her voice hard as flint. "And I didn't run away. They tied me to a stake in a creek bed during a storm and left me to drown. If it weren't for Caleb's stride here, I'd be dead, and they'd have told everyone I ran off and got lost." Jeremiah's face flushed red. "That's a lie." "She's confused, Sheriff. The girl's been cursed since birth, brings misfortune everywhere she goes. We tried to take her west with us, but she ran off one night. We've been worried sick." "Worried sick," Nora repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. "Is that why you waited 6 months to come looking? Is that why you brought a sheriff instead of coming yourselves?" She turned her attention back to Hawkins. "Sheriff, I can take you to the exact spot where they left me. The stake they tied me to is probably still there. And I'd wager if you check the timeline of their story against when they actually left Bitter Ridge, you'll find some interesting gaps." The thin woman spoke up then, her voice reedy and uncertain. "I'm Sarah, Jeremiah's sister. I only heard about all this last month when they showed up at my place. The story didn't sit right with me, all the holes in it. That's why I insisted we bring the sheriff." Jeremiah shot his sister a look of pure venom, but Hawkins held up his hand. "Miss Ashby, are you here of your own free will? Is Mr. Stride holding you against your wishes in any way?" "I'm here because I choose to be," Nora said firmly. "Caleb saved my life and gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. I've stayed because this is my home now. I'm not going back with them. Not now, not ever." Violet spoke for the first time, her voice small and tight. "Nora, please. Papa's sick and the crops failed again. We need you." The admission hung in the air, raw and desperate. They didn't want her back out of love or concern. They wanted her back because they were failing, and they needed someone to blame, someone to work, someone to carry their burdens. The old Nora might have felt guilty, might have been swayed by obligation or duty. But that Nora had drowned in the mud. "You need me," Nora repeated slowly. "The same way you needed me gone when things were going well enough. The same way you needed me to die so you could start fresh without your family curse. No, Violet, you don't need me. You need to take responsibility for your own choices and stop blaming your failures on a girl you tried to murder." "We didn't try to murder you," Clayton burst out, his voice defensive. "We just thought if you went on your own, natural-like, it would solve everyone's problems. We didn't mean for you to suffer. Natural-like." Caleb's voice cut through the air like a blade, cold and deadly. You tied a 19-year-old girl to a stake in a flooding creek bed and rode away. There's nothing natural about that. That's attempted murder in any territory I know of. And if the sheriff here does his job right, you'll all be facing charges." Hawkins looked troubled, his gaze moving between the family and Nora. "Miss Ashby, I need to be clear about something. If you want to press charges, I'll take these folks into custody right now. But it'll mean trials, testimony, reliving everything that happened. It'll mean your name in every newspaper from here to the coast. Are you prepared for that?" Nora felt Caleb's presence behind her, solid and supportive, and she drew strength from it. She thought about what pressing charges would mean, the long process of justice, the public scrutiny. Part of her wanted it, wanted to see them face consequences for what they'd done. But another part, the part that had learned to survive and move forward, recognized that revenge was a chain that would bind her to them forever. "No," she said finally. "I don't want to press charges, but I want them gone from here. And I want them to know that if they ever come back, if they ever tell lies about me or Caleb, if they ever try to interfere in my life again, I will press charges. I'll tell the whole story to anyone who'll listen. Do you understand me?" Jeremiah's jaw worked like he wanted to argue, but Sarah spoke first. "We understand. Jeremiah, Violet, Clayton, we're leaving. Now, but the crops," Violet started, tears streaming down her face. "We're going to lose everything." "Then you'll lose everything," Sarah said firmly. "You made your choices. You tried to kill this girl to solve your problems, and now you have to live with the consequences. Not her, you." As they turned to leave, Nora felt something unexpected wash over her. Not satisfaction or triumph, but a quiet sense of closure. They looked smaller now, less like the monsters who'd haunted her nightmares, and more like desperate, broken people who'd made terrible choices. She didn't forgive them, didn't excuse what they'd done, but she also didn't need their suffering to validate her own survival. Sheriff Hawkins lingered after the others had started down the trail. "Miss Ashby, for what it's worth, I believe you. And if you change your mind about pressing charges, you can reach me in Red Creek. There's still time to pursue this legally. Thank you, Sheriff. But I meant what I said. I'm done with them. I've built a new life here, and I don't want them poisoning it with their presence or their trial." Hawkins nodded, tipped his hat to both of them, and rode off after the others. Nora stood watching until they disappeared from view, feeling Caleb's hand settle on her shoulder. "You did good," he said quietly. "That took strength, letting them go." "Did it?" Nora turned to face him, searching his eyes. "Part of me wanted to see them suffer, wanted to watch them face justice for what they did. Does that make me weak for choosing otherwise?" "No, it makes you smart. And free." Caleb's hand moved to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You're not bound to them anymore, not by hate or the need for revenge. You're bound to nothing except your own choices. That's the strongest thing a person can be." Nora leaned into his touch, feeling the last vestiges of her old life fall away like dead skin. "I thought I'd feel different seeing them again. I thought I'd be afraid or angry or something. But mostly I just felt sorry for them. They're still trapped in the same patterns, still blaming their problems on things outside themselves. They'll never be free. And you are," Caleb said, and it wasn't a question. That night they sat by the fire as they had so many nights before, but everything felt different now. The confrontation with her past had crystallized something in Nora, a final severing of the ties that had defined her for so long. She wasn't Jeremiah's burden anymore. She wasn't Bitterridge's cursed girl. She was simply Nora, a woman who'd survived and chosen to build something new from the ashes of her old life. "I never thanked you properly," she said into the comfortable silence. "For pulling me out of that creek bed, for giving me shelter, for teaching me how to be strong." Caleb looked up from the wood he was carving. "You don't owe me thanks. You earned everything you have here through your own work, your own determination. I just provided the opportunity. You provided more than that. You provided belief when I had none in myself. You saw something in me worth saving when the whole world had decided I was disposable." Nora set down her mending and moved to sit beside him. "You gave me my life back, Caleb, not just by saving me from drowning, but by showing me what life could be when you chose it for yourself instead of having it chosen for you." Caleb set down his carving, his expression serious. "Nora, I need you to understand something. What we have here, this life we're building, it's not going to be easy. People are going to talk, are going to make assumptions. Some will say you're my woman living in sin. Others will say I've taken advantage of you, that you're too young to know what you want. There will be judgment and gossip and probably worse." "I know," Nora said simply, "and I don't care. Let them talk. Let them judge. I've been judged my whole life for things I couldn't control. At least now I'm being judged for choices I've actively made. That feels like freedom to me." Caleb reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. "Then I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. When we go to Pine Hollow next week, I want to ask Martha if she knows a preacher who travels these territories. I want to marry you properly, Nora, not because society demands it or because I'm worried about gossip, but because I want the world to know you're my partner, my equal, my chosen family. Will you have me?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Nora looked at this man who'd saved her life and then given her the tools to save herself, who'd been patient when she needed patience and hard when she needed hardness, who'd shown her through action, rather than words, what it meant to be respected and valued. And she knew her answer with absolute certainty. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I'll marry you, Caleb Stride. Not because I need protection or security, but because I love you. Because I choose you the same way I choose this life, with my eyes open and my heart sure." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, like they were both testing the reality of this new territory. But then it deepened, became something more urgent, more real. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said roughly. "Didn't think I was capable of it anymore. Thought that part of me had died years ago. But you brought it back, brought me back." They sat together as the fire burned low, making quiet plans for their future. They'd go to Pine Hollow, find a preacher, get married properly. They'd build a better cabin before next winter, something with more room, maybe a separate bedroom and a proper root cellar. They'd expand the trap lines, maybe take on an apprentice in a few years when they could afford extra help. Small dreams, practical dreams, but dreams nonetheless. And as Nora finally climbed to the loft that night, she realized that the girl who'd been tied to a stake in a creek bed was completely and utterly dead. In her place was a woman who knew her own mind, who'd killed to protect what mattered, who'd faced her past with courage and chosen her future with clarity. The cursed girl of Bitter Ridge had become Nora Stride, partner to a hunter, survivor of winter, defender of her home. Tomorrow they'd start preparing for the trip to Pine Hollow. But tonight, Nora let herself simply be happy, let herself feel the full weight of the life she'd claimed for herself. She'd been thrown away like trash, left to die in the mud. But she'd become something her family never anticipated. Free. The journey to Pine Hollow took 2 days instead of 1, because Nora insisted on stopping at the creek bed where Caleb had found her. She needed to see it again, needed to close that chapter properly before moving forward into her new life. Caleb didn't question her decision, just guided them to the spot with the quiet understanding that had become the foundation of their relationship. The creek was peaceful now in the late spring sunshine, the water running clear and gentle over smooth stones. The cottonwood stake still stood, weathered and leaning but unmistakable, a monument to her near death. Nora dismounted and walked to it slowly, her hand reaching out to touch the wood that had held the ropes that bound her. "I should hate this place," she said quietly, aware of Caleb watching from a respectful distance. "I should want to burn this stake to the ground and never think of it again. But standing here now, knowing what came after, I can't bring myself to hate it. This place was the end of one life and the beginning of another. It was the bottom, which meant the only direction left was up." She pulled out the knife Caleb had given her, the one she'd learned to use for skinning and carving and, when necessary, fighting. With deliberate strokes, she carved words into the steak. Letters rough but readable. Nora Ashby survived. Not elaborate, not poetic. Just truth carved into wood for anyone who might pass this way to see. Caleb appeared beside her, studying her handiwork. Someone might wonder what that means. Let them wonder, Nora said, sheathing her knife. Or maybe someone else who feels like they're drowning will see it and know that survival is possible. That being left for dead isn't the same as being dead. That you can come back from the worst thing that ever happened to you and build something beautiful on the other side. They rode on toward Pine Hollow, and Nora felt lighter somehow. Like carving those words had released something she'd been carrying without realizing it. The past was the past now. Not a weight dragging her down, but a foundation she'd built herself upon. Martha Coltrane let out a whoop of delight when she saw them riding up to the trading post, immediately pulling Nora into a bone-crushing hug. I heard about Pike and his boys. Word travels fast out here, and the story being told is that you two fought off 5 armed men and sent them packing. Is it true? 4 men, Caleb corrected mildly. Pike ran before we could finish the conversation. Thomas emerged from the smithy, grinning broadly. And here, I thought this winter might be dull. You two have provided enough gossip to last us till next spring. Come inside, we've got fresh bread and you can tell us everything. Over dinner that night, surrounded by the warmth and noise of the trading post, Nora felt something settle into place. These people knew her story, or at least parts of it, and they didn't look at her with pity or judgment. They looked at her with respect, with the kind of regard earned through action rather than given through birthright. Martha kept refilling her plate, and Thomas told stories about other homesteaders who'd had to defend their claims from raiders, normalizing what Nora had done instead of treating her like an oddity. After the meal, as Caleb spoke quietly with Thomas about supplies, Martha pulled Nora aside. There's something different about you since last fall. You've always been capable, but now there's a hardness to you, the good kind. The kind that comes from knowing what you can survive. I killed a man, Nora said quietly, during the attack. I shot him to protect Caleb, and he died. Does that make me hard or just practical? Martha studied her with those sharp, knowing eyes. It makes you a survivor, and out here, that's the highest compliment I can give. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for doing what was necessary. The world's full of people who'll judge you for defending yourself while they hide behind closed doors and locked windows. Their opinions aren't worth the breath it takes to speak them. Caleb asked me to marry him, Nora said, changing the subject, but also not changing it at all. We were hoping you might know a preacher who travels through these parts. Martha's face split into a genuine smile. I do better than that. Circuit preacher comes through every 6 weeks, and he's due day after tomorrow. If you're willing to wait, he can perform the ceremony right here. We'll make it an event, invite the other homesteaders in the area, give folks something to celebrate instead of just surviving. The idea of a real wedding, of community celebration, felt both thrilling and terrifying. But Nora nodded, committing to it. We'll wait. And Martha, thank you for everything. For treating me like a person instead of a curiosity or a problem. That's because you are a person, and a damn fine one at that, Martha said firmly. Now let's talk about what you're going to wear. Can't have you getting married in buckskins, though Lord knows you wear them well enough. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Martha produced a dress that had belonged to her daughter, who'd married and moved east years before. It was simple but well made, deep blue calico with pearl buttons, and it fit Nora almost perfectly with just a few adjustments. Other families began arriving at the trading post, drawn by word of the wedding, bringing food and gifts and stories. Nora met more people in those 2 days than she had in the entire previous year, and what struck her most was how readily they accepted her. There was old man Fletcher, who'd lost his wife to fever 2 winters back, and told Nora with tears in his eyes that it did his heart good to see young people choosing love, despite the hardness of this life. There was the Wong family, who ran a successful claim 20 miles north and brought beautifully embroidered linens as a gift. There was Sarah Brennan, a widow with 3 children, who told Nora quietly that she'd heard whispers of her story and wanted her to know that starting over was possible, that building a new life from ashes was what this territory was all about. The preacher, when he arrived, was not what Nora expected. Reverend Hayes was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and dirt under his fingernails from helping someone fix a wagon wheel on his way to Pine Hollow. He spoke to Nora and Caleb privately before the ceremony, asking them serious questions about commitment and partnership and whether they understood the weight of the promises they were about to make. "I won't ask if you love each other," he said, looking between them. "That's obvious enough. What I need to know is whether you're prepared to choose each other even when love feels hard, even when life gets harder than it already is, even when the easy path would be to walk away. Marriage in the wilderness isn't romantic poetry. It's a daily choice to stand beside someone through everything the world throws at you." Nora met Caleb's eyes and saw her own certainty reflected back. "We've already been through the hard parts," she said. "We've defended each other against violence, survived winter together, faced down the worst of both our pasts. If that's not proof we can handle whatever comes, I don't know what is." The ceremony took place outside as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible in their beauty. Nora stood beside Caleb, her hand in his, and spoke vows that were both traditional and personal. She promised to stand beside him, to share both burdens and joys, to choose him daily for as long as they both lived. And when he spoke his own vows, his voice rough with emotion, she felt tears slide down her cheeks. "I promise to see you as you are, not as the world tried to make you. I promise to honor your strength and your choices. I promise to defend what we've built together with everything I have. And I promise that you'll never again face the world alone." When Reverend Hayes pronounced them married and Caleb kissed her, the small crowd erupted in cheers. Martha was crying openly, and Thomas was grinning like a fool, and Nora felt surrounded by something she'd never experienced before: genuine community. People who'd chosen to celebrate her happiness instead of diminishing it. The celebration lasted long into the night, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible. Nora danced with Caleb, with Thomas, with Old Man Fletcher, who told her stories about his own wedding 40 years prior. She laughed until her sides ached and ate until she thought she might burst, and felt, for the first time in her entire life, like she truly belonged somewhere. Later, much later, when they'd finally retreated to the small cabin Martha had prepared for them, Nora stood at the window looking out at the stars. Caleb came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and they stood in comfortable silence. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd ridden past that creek bed?" he asked quietly. "If I'd been an hour earlier or later, if I'd taken a different trail?" "I used to," Nora admitted. "In the early days, I'd lie awake thinking about all the ways I might have died if circumstances had been slightly different. But I don't anymore. What happened, happened, and maybe it was chance or fate or just dumb luck, but it led here, to this moment, to us. And I wouldn't trade that for anything, not even an easier past." Caleb turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You know that going back to the cabin means going back to a hard life. The work won't get easier, the winters won't get warmer, the isolation won't magically disappear. Are you truly ready for that?" Nora reached up to cup his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. "I'm not ready for an easy life, Caleb. Easy lives make soft people, and I've worked too hard to become strong to risk that. I'm ready for a real life, a chosen life, a life where I matter because of what I contribute and who I choose to be. That's what you've given me, and that's what I want." They left Pine Hollow 3 days later, their pack mule loaded with supplies and gifts, their hearts full of the warmth of community. The ride back was peaceful. Spring fully emerged now, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and birds singing from every tree. Nora breathed it in, this life she'd claimed, this future she'd built from nothing. When they finally saw the cabin through the trees, Nora felt a surge of emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't much to look at, just a rough wooden structure with a stone chimney and a small garden plot. But it was hers, not given to her by family obligation or social expectation, but earned through her own sweat and choices. Home. That night, as they settled back into their familiar routines, Nora found herself thinking about the girl who'd been tied to that stake. That girl had been so certain she was cursed, so convinced that her life was worth less than others, so broken by other people's judgments. And now that girl was gone, transformed into someone who knew her own worth, who'd killed to defend what mattered, who'd faced her past with courage and chosen her future with clarity. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, from where he sat carving by the fire. "I'm thinking about curses," Nora said slowly. "How my stepfather called me cursed because bad things happened around me. But the truth is he was the curse. His cruelty, his superstition, his willingness to sacrifice me to solve his problems. That was the real poison. And by leaving me to die, he thought he was removing the curse. But all he did was free me from it." Caleb set down his carving. "And now?" "Now I'm blessed," Nora said simply. "Blessed with strength I didn't know I had. Blessed with a partner who sees me as an equal. Blessed with a life I chose instead of one that was chosen for me." The cursed girl died in that creek bed. What survived was something better. She walked over to Caleb and settled beside him, taking up her own carving project, a spoon she'd been working on for weeks. They sat together in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the night settling around them peaceful and safe. Outside, the wilderness stretched vast and untamed, full of dangers and hardships. But inside this cabin, Nora had built something that couldn't be taken from her, a sense of self, earned through survival and strengthened through choice. Months would pass, then years. They'd build a bigger cabin, take on apprentices, become known throughout the territory as people you could trust, people who'd help those in need. Nora would become legendary in her own right, the woman who fought beside her husband, who could track and hunt and heal. People would tell stories about her, about the cursed girl who became a legend, about the woman who refused to stay buried. But that was all to come. Tonight was just the beginning, just the first night of a life built on the ashes of the old one. And as Nora sat beside her husband carving wood in the firelight, she felt a peace deeper than contentment. She felt purpose. She felt strength. She felt free. They'd tried to leave her bound in the mud for being cursed, but she'd survived. She'd done more than survive. She'd transformed. And now, everyone who'd ever doubted her worth, everyone who'd ever called her cursed or disposable or worthless, they all had to live with the knowledge that they'd been wrong, that Nora Ashby Stride was stronger than their cruelty, more resilient than their hatred, more powerful than their attempts to destroy her. And that was the best revenge of all, living well, loving deeply, and building a legacy that would outlast every person who'd ever tried to bury her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.